From my office in Chicago, I watched hidden camera footage of my wife waltzing home. Her skin sun-kissed from a trip she claimed was with her sisters. She poured wine, sighed, and said flatly, "I'm on antibiotics. One of the guys I slept with gave me gonorrhea." That was the moment I knew. She'd destroyed us, and I was going to take everything she cared about with meticulous precision. Ethan Carter never thought he'd be the kind of man who installed hidden cameras in his own home. For most of his life, he believed that trust was the bedrock of any relationship. But trust had begun to feel like a luxury he could no longer afford. He was 42, a managing partner at a private equity firm in downtown Chicago. His days were a blur of negotiations, investment strategies, and constant pressure to outperform. When he married Lauren 13 years earlier, he thought he'd found someone who understood his drive, who shared his ambitions. For a while, that had been true. In the early years, Lauren had been engaged, supportive, excited to build a life together. But over time, Ethan began to notice how her enthusiasm cooled. She stopped asking about his work. She stopped sharing much about hers. She started spending weekends visiting her sisters, and returning with a distant look he didn't recognize. At first, Ethan dismissed the changes as the natural drift that happens in any long marriage. He told himself he was imagining it. Maybe he had been too consumed by work, too distracted to be the husband she deserved. But the excuses wore thin as her absences grew longer and her explanations shorter. The night everything changed had begun like any other. Ethan stayed late at the office, reviewing a portfolio that could make or break the quarter. It was after 11 when he finally turned off the desk lamp and reached for his phone. A notification glowed on the screen, a motion alert from the living room camera. His stomach tightened. He'd installed the system 6 weeks earlier. After he came home early one Friday and found Lauren on a video call, she'd scrambled to end the moment he walked in. He told himself the cameras were just a precaution, a way to quiet the gnawing sense that something wasn't right. He hadn't expected to see anything incriminating. Not really. He'd hoped, in a quiet, desperate way, that he'd find nothing at all. But when he opened the app, the live feed showed Lauren stepping into the kitchen. She moved with a careless ease that almost made him believe she had nothing to hide. Almost. She pulled a bottle of wine from the cabinet, poured a glass, and stood for a moment, staring into the middle distance as though weighing whether to say something out loud. Then she spoke. Her voice was calm, almost bored. "I'm on antibiotics," she said, setting the glass down. "One of the guys I slept with gave me gonorrhea." Ethan felt the words strike him in a place too deep to reach. For a moment he simply stared, convinced he must have misheard. He replayed the recording twice. Each time, the same sentence delivered with the same hollow detachment. He turned off the screen and sat in the dark, listening to the silence of the office. He thought about the years he'd invested in their life together, about every sacrifice he'd justified in the name of building security and success, about the woman who'd stood beside him through the best and worst of it, until she decided he no longer mattered. By the time dawn bled into the city skyline, Ethan felt something cold and precise settle into place inside him. He wasn't going to confront her in anger. He wasn't going to scream or plead. He would approach this as he would any failing enterprise. Gather the facts, control the narrative, and ensure that the person responsible bore every consequence. That morning, as Lauren slept upstairs, Ethan sat at his dining table scrolling through her credit card statements. A charge at a boutique resort in Mykonos, supposedly her sister's cruise, stood out immediately. So did payments to a man named Nikolai Petrova, a photographer she had allegedly hired for private sessions. Private, indeed. He texted his longtime cybersecurity consultant, a man named Gabriel, who owed him more than a few favors. He explained, in simple terms, what he needed: full access to Lauren's emails, phone records, and any cloud storage she'd forgotten to secure. Gabriel didn't ask questions. Within hours, Ethan received the first batch of data. What he read made it impossible to pretend any of this was a misunderstanding. There were flight itineraries to Greece, booked months in advance under her maiden name. There were long, affectionate email threads with Nikolai, One message included a photograph of Lauren on a balcony overlooking the sea, holding up a glass of champagne. The caption read, "Counting down the days until we're here again." Ethan felt something burn in the back of his throat. He had never thought of himself as naive, but the evidence was overwhelming. Lauren had crafted a second life, and she'd done it with the confidence of someone who believed she'd never be caught. He closed the laptop and let the stillness of the house fill his head. He thought about how easily she had lied to him, how she had smiled when she returned from her trip, telling him stories about late nights laughing with my sisters, all while she was with someone else. That was the moment Ethan decided he would not simply walk away. He would not grant her the satisfaction of a quiet separation. He would dismantle everything she had built, the finances, the reputation, the network of friends who believed she was something she was not. He would make sure she understood that betrayal was never without consequences. In that instant, all the hurt and disbelief resolved into a single, unshakable purpose. This was no longer about heartbreak. It was about precision. Ethan knew that gathering evidence was only the first step. If he wanted to confront Lauren in a way she couldn't deny or twist, he needed irrefutable proof, compiled methodically, like a case he'd build against a fraudulent business partner. Over the next week, he maintained the appearance of normalcy. He left for the office early, returned late, and spoke to Lauren in a tone so measured it startled even him. She seemed oblivious, absorbed in her routines, responding with casual affection he now recognized as practiced. In the evenings, Ethan spread out documents across the table in his study. Travel receipts, bank statements, and emails that chronicled months of deception. Each transaction told a story she'd never intended him to read. The resort in Mykonos was the first puzzle piece, but the more he uncovered, the clearer the picture became. She hadn't merely taken a lover. She had built an alternate existence with him, complete with shared plans and private language. One message stood out among the rest. Lauren had written to Nikolai, "Sometimes I forget who I'm supposed to be when I come home." It struck Ethan harder than anything else. It wasn't just about sex. She had crossed a line so complete she no longer felt connected to her own life with him. But emotional betrayal wasn't the only crime. Lauren had used a joint account to pay for her flights, hotel upgrades, and expensive dinners. Ethan traced the transactions with meticulous care. He didn't want to confront her with accusations she could dismiss. He wanted receipts, photos, dates, names. Gabriel sent him a secure file containing Lauren's private messages and call logs. Ethan read every line. Nikolai wasn't some casual fling. He was a calculated choice. A man whose work, sensual photography, offered perfect cover for extended trips and hidden encounters. The tone of their exchanges was intimate, almost conspiratorial. They joked about the performance Lauren put on for her friends and family. Ethan could feel the shape of her duplicity expanding. She wasn't simply lying to him. She was lying to everyone. But the most damning evidence came in the form of a folder marked session proofs. Inside were time-stamped photographs from the resort, including one of Lauren in a robe, her hair damp, her wedding ring visible on her hand as she raised a glass to the camera. The metadata confirmed the date. 2 days after she texted Ethan she was missing him already. Ethan stared at the image until the lines blurred. Then he closed the laptop and picked up his phone. He called a private investigator he'd worked with before, a man named Sullivan who specialized in high-net-worth cases. Sullivan didn't ask why Ethan wanted surveillance. He only asked where to start. Within 72 hours, Sullivan delivered a dossier so thorough it left no room for doubt. Photos of Lauren and Nikolai dining on a candlelit patio, walking along the shore, disappearing into a private villa. The time-stamped footage showed them entering the suite late at night and leaving hours later, their expressions unguarded. Ethan reviewed it all without reacting. Emotion had no place here anymore. When he was sure he had everything, he began preparing the next stage: containment and leverage. He knew Lauren prized her image in Chicago's philanthropic circles. She chaired charity galas, advised arts organizations, and cultivated a reputation as a generous, principled woman. The contrast between that persona and the truth in his files was stark enough to dismantle her standing overnight. The first step was financial. Ethan met with his attorney in a corner office downtown, explaining that he intended to restrict access to all shared assets. He wanted it done quietly. No alerts, no sudden denials of credit that might tip Lauren off. Instead, he arranged a series of incremental freezes that would take effect over the course of 2 weeks. Just enough to make her think the problem was a technical glitch. Next came her professional life. Ethan prepared an anonymous package of evidence. Select emails, hotel receipts, and a handful of photos. He addressed it to 3 people who sat on the board of a major cultural foundation where Lauren was a trustee. No letter, no commentary, only the documents themselves. He didn't want to accuse her. He wanted her to have to explain herself. He also contacted 2 close friends of hers, people who believed they knew her better than anyone. In calm, measured calls, he asked if they'd noticed Lauren seemed distracted lately, if she'd mentioned anything about her last trip. He didn't reveal what he knew. He didn't need to. The idea was to plant questions that would grow into suspicion by the time he was ready to reveal the truth. Each action was deliberate. He wasn't acting out of impulse or rage. He was following a plan that served a single purpose: to make sure Lauren could never pretend she hadn't betrayed him. The hardest part was maintaining the facade at home. Ethan sat across from her at the dinner table, listened to her stories about her meetings, and forced himself to nod. The dissonance was surreal. She spoke about small frustrations with her volunteer work as if nothing had changed, as if she hadn't shattered the foundation of their life together. But the longer Ethan watched her pretend, the more certain he became that he was doing the right thing. Late one night, after she'd gone to bed, he compiled everything: documents, photos, video clips, into a single folder labeled Truth. When he finished, he backed it up 3 times and stored it on separate drives. He knew that when he finally confronted her, she would deny it all. She would cry, insist he misunderstood, try to twist the narrative into something softer. But this time, she would have nowhere to hide. When he closed the final file, Ethan felt the last of his illusions fall away. The woman upstairs was no longer the person he'd promised to spend his life with. She was a stranger who had mistaken his loyalty for weakness, and she was about to discover just how wrong she'd been. Ethan knew the confrontation had to be controlled. If he allowed emotion to take over, the moment would lose its power. This was not about shouting or humiliating Lauren in a fit of rage. It was about making her acknowledge what she had done without the possibility of deflecting or minimizing it. He spent several days finalizing every detail. Each account freeze was in place. The quiet rumors he had started among her friends and colleagues were spreading exactly as he intended. The board members of the foundation had already called an emergency meeting, though Lauren hadn't realized yet that it was about her. He decided to set the confrontation for a Wednesday evening. He chose that night because it was the midpoint of her carefully managed week, a time when she would be least prepared for disruption. Ethan came home early. He sat at the kitchen table, reviewing the file one last time on his laptop. Every photo, every email, every transaction had been arranged in chronological order. There was no way she could claim any of it was fabricated. He rehearsed what he would say, not because he expected to need a script, but because he refused to let her provoke him into an argument. When Lauren walked through the front door, she didn't notice at first that anything was different. She hung up her coat, checked her phone, and glanced at Ethan with a polite, distracted smile. "You're home early," she said, setting her bag on the counter. He nodded. "I thought it was time we had a conversation." She raised her eyebrows, clearly trying to assess his tone. "About what?" Ethan gestured to the chair across from him. "Sit down." Lauren hesitated. He saw her weigh whether to deflect or make an excuse to leave. But something in his voice must have warned her this wasn't the usual dynamic. She pulled out the chair and sat, folding her hands in her lap. He turned the laptop toward her and pressed play. The first image appeared. Lauren and Nikolai seated at an outdoor restaurant, their heads bent close together. The date and time were displayed in the corner of the frame. The next clip showed them entering a hotel lobby, her hand resting lightly on his arm. Then another, her luggage being carried into the suite. Lauren's eyes flickered, but she said nothing. Ethan let the footage continue. A series of still photos followed, her in the robe, Nikolai pouring wine, the two of them on the balcony overlooking the sea. Finally, the video cut to a screen showing the credit card transactions and email confirmations, each one annotated with dates and amounts. When it ended, he closed the laptop. The room was silent except for the quiet tick of the kitchen clock. "Do you have anything you'd like to say?" he asked. Lauren swallowed, her expression shifting from defiance to something closer to panic. "Ethan, don't lie," he interrupted. His voice was steady, measured. "Not now." She opened her mouth, closed it again, then pressed her hands flat against the table. "I didn't plan for it to happen. It was just. You didn't plan to spend thousands of dollars on hotels and private photographers?" He kept his gaze locked on hers. "You didn't plan to lie to everyone who trusted you?" Her shoulders hunched. "It wasn't serious. You have to understand, I was lonely. You were never here. Felt like you'd already left me behind." He waited a beat before responding. "You're not going to make this about me." Lauren's voice dropped to a whisper. "I'm sorry." Ethan leaned back in his chair. "I'm sure you are. But sorry doesn't change the fact that you built an entire life around deceiving me." She wiped at her cheek. He felt nothing. No urge to comfort her. No pull of nostalgia for the years they'd spent together. That part of him was gone. "I've started the process of separating our finances," he continued. "Within a week, you won't have access to any of the accounts you've been using." Her head snapped up. "Ethan, please." "No." His tone was final. "You made these choices. You can live with the consequences." Lauren's composure cracked. "What do you want me to do?" "I want you to pack your things. You have until Friday." Her breath came shallow, uneven. "Where will I go?" "That's not my concern." He stood. "I won't be here while you collect your things. I've arranged for my attorney to handle any communication from this point on." She buried her face in her hands, her voice muffled. "You don't have to do this." He watched her for a moment, measuring whether he felt any regret. He didn't. "You already did," he said simply. He picked up the laptop and left the kitchen. As he crossed the threshold to the hallway, he paused, glancing back once to see her hunched over the table, her body shaking. This, he realized, was the moment he'd been working toward. Not the evidence gathering or the quiet dismantling of her facade, but the instant she could no longer pretend. The instant the truth outpaced any story she could spin. He walked out the front door without another word. Outside, the evening air felt cold and sharp on his skin. He inhaled deeply, feeling the weight of years lift from his shoulders. There would still be fallout, people to call, arrangements to finalize. But that was manageable. What mattered was that the hardest part was over. The confrontation was not about anger. It was about clarity. And for the first time in months, Ethan felt clear. The day after Ethan walked out, Lauren tried calling him. He ignored every attempt. By the end of the week, she'd left 7 voicemails, each more frantic than the last. She never once denied what she'd done. She only asked him to reconsider the timing, to let her explain everything in person. He never responded. Friday morning, while she was at work, Ethan returned to the house with his attorney and 2 moving professionals. They boxed the last of his personal effects and secured all the documents he'd compiled. He left a single envelope on the kitchen counter. Inside was the formal notice of separation and a list of accounts she no longer controlled. By the time Lauren came home, her access to every shared resource was cut off. Her credit cards declined. Her passwords no longer worked. There was nothing accidental about it. Ethan wanted her to understand that the life she'd built on deception had no safe harbor. That weekend, he checked into a hotel near the office. He wasn't ready to move back into the house, not while the memory of her presence still clung to the place. He spent those nights reviewing the second phase of his plan. The professional exposure Lauren never imagined he'd pursue. He hadn't decided lightly to share what he'd found with her colleagues and friends. But the more he considered her deliberate choices, funding her affair with joint money, lying to everyone around her, the less reason he saw to protect her image. The anonymous packages arrived on Monday. He'd timed them precisely. That morning, the foundation board convened a special session. Each board member received an envelope with selected documentation, the photos of Lauren and Nikolai at the resort, the invoices charged to her charity's travel budget, and a short letter summarizing the timeline of her affair. Ethan didn't sign the letter. He didn't need to. The documents spoke for themselves. By the time Lauren arrived at her office, the board chair was waiting for her in the lobby. Witnesses later told Ethan that she looked confused at first, then stricken when she saw what was in the file. She tried to explain, she always tried, but there was no explanation that could reconcile the evidence. Within hours, her appointment was suspended pending a full investigation into financial impropriety and reputational harm. Ethan knew this was only the beginning. Word spread quickly. The donors who had underwritten Lauren's charity galas began to pull out. One by one, they released statements citing ethical concerns. Events were canceled. Invitations were rescinded. The same friends who used to praise her generosity now treated her like a liability. Ethan didn't revel in her collapse. He didn't feel triumphant. What he felt was the same calm certainty he'd carried since the moment he pressed play on that first video. Actions had consequences. Lauren had made her choices. He was simply ensuring those choices were finally visible to everyone she'd deceived. On Wednesday afternoon, he received a call from Sullivan, the private investigator. She tried to meet with Nikolai, Sullivan reported. It didn't go well. What happened? Ethan asked. He told her he couldn't be seen with her. He's worried about his own reputation. Ethan let that sink in. For all her assurances that what they shared was special, Nikolai had cut ties the instant the fallout threatened his standing. By the end of the week, Lauren was alone in every sense. Her financial accounts were restricted, her professional network was dissolving, and the man she'd risked everything for had abandoned her. Ethan thought about the years he'd spent believing in her, in the future they were supposed to build together. He felt a hollow acknowledgement that none of it had been real, not in the way he'd believed. He also felt something close to relief. Saturday morning, his attorney delivered the last of the legal documents finalizing the separation of their assets. There was nothing left for Lauren to contest. She would have a modest settlement, enough to start over, but nothing close to the security she'd once counted on. She called again that evening. For the first time in weeks, Ethan answered. Her voice came through thin and uneven. Ethan, please, just talk to me. There's nothing left to talk about, he said. I never wanted it to end like this, she whispered. You made your decisions. I know I did. But everything is gone now. Everything. He closed his eyes, feeling no satisfaction. I warned you. You thought I'd look the other way. A long pause. Can you forgive me? No. He ended the call without waiting for her response. In the days that followed, the shock in their circles turned to gossip, then to indifference. People who had once admired Lauren's social profile quietly moved on to the next cause, the next face. Her story became a cautionary tale whispered behind closed doors. Ethan didn't engage. He poured himself into work, closing 2 major deals and re-establishing the professional momentum he'd neglected in the last year. His partners noticed the change and commented on his renewed focus. One evening, as he left the office, he paused on the sidewalk and looked up at the skyline. He thought about how much had collapsed in such a short span of time, about how easily trust could be dismantled when someone decided their own needs mattered more than their word. He didn't feel angry anymore. He didn't feel grief. What remained was a quiet clarity he hadn't experienced in years. The life he'd shared with Lauren was over. The woman he thought he loved no longer existed. And though the road ahead would be unfamiliar, it was finally his alone. Months passed. Ethan never once considered reversing his decision. Each week without Lauren brought another layer of clarity he hadn't known he needed. He moved into a condominium overlooking the Chicago River, smaller and simpler than the house he'd shared with her. There was no rush to fill it with new furniture or memories. He was content to let the silence remind him of how far he'd come. He kept working. His firm had a banner quarter, and clients remarked on his focus. Some evenings, he stayed late simply because it felt good to be surrounded by things he could control. Numbers didn't lie. Results didn't pretend to be something they weren't. Now and then, Ethan's mind drifted back to the night he watched the footage of Lauren. He didn't replay it, but he remembered it clearly. It wasn't the moment she confessed to infidelity that stayed with him. It was the calm way she had spoken, as if the betrayal were a fact of life rather than a choice. The difference between them had always been that Ethan believed commitments mattered. Lauren believed she was entitled to exceptions. By early spring, her public disgrace had settled into something more permanent. The foundation formally removed her from the board. Her name vanished from the programs of every charity she had once championed. The friends who remained in contact with her did so quietly, out of pity more than solidarity. One evening, Ethan returned home to find a letter waiting in his mailbox. No return address, but the handwriting was familiar. He carried it upstairs and left it on the table for nearly an hour before opening it. "Ethan, you were right about everything. I've spent the last few months trying to understand how I could betray you so completely. There's no excuse, only regret. I've decided to leave Chicago. I can't stay here. Every place reminds me of what I did. I don't expect forgiveness. I only hope that someday you'll remember we once loved each other, and that not every moment we shared was a lie. I'm sorry, Lauren." He read it twice. Then he folded the paper neatly and set it aside. He felt no temptation to respond. Apologies were easy. They didn't erase choices. Over the next weeks, Ethan started attending small gatherings he'd once avoided. Fundraisers, networking events, dinners where he could stand in a crowded room without feeling like he had to pretend. At first, it was uncomfortable. But slowly, he realized he wasn't thinking about Lauren anymore. One Thursday evening, he attended a benefit for children's literacy. It was a modest affair compared to the lavish galas Lauren used to orchestrate. Maybe that was why he found it easier to stay. People spoke plainly. No one measured their worth by which table they were seated at. Near the end of the night, a woman approached him. She was a few years younger than Lauren, poised but warm. "You're Ethan Carter," she said, extending her hand. "I've heard about the work your firm does with the Harper Initiative." "That's right," he replied. "And you are?" "Isabella Reyes," she said. "I run the Reyes Family Foundation." They talked for nearly an hour, long after most of the guests had left. Her questions were thoughtful, not rehearsed. She didn't seem interested in his reputation or the stories about what had happened with Lauren. She only wanted to understand how his work might connect with hers. As he said goodnight and walked to his car, Ethan caught himself smiling, an unforced expression he hadn't felt in a long time. The next morning, he emailed Isabella to thank her for the conversation. She replied almost immediately, suggesting they meet to discuss a potential partnership. For the first time since his marriage ended, Ethan felt a sense of possibility he trusted. A few weeks later, they met for coffee. Their conversation ranged from philanthropy to travel to the simple fact that, despite everything, he still believed in commitments that meant something. She listened without judgment. When they parted, Isabella paused before stepping away. "You strike me as someone who's learned a lot the hard way," she said. "I have," Ethan replied. "Then you probably already know this," she continued. "The way people treat you when you have nothing left to offer them. That's who they really are." He nodded. "Yes, I've learned that." Driving home, Ethan thought about how true those words were. Lauren had only been loyal as long as it suited her. Nikolai had only stayed until it was inconvenient. Their entire arrangement had been built on self-interest. What Ethan wanted now was simpler. Honesty, even if it was difficult. Respect, even if it wasn't convenient. By early summer, Lauren had left Chicago for good. Someone mentioned she'd moved to Arizona to start over. He felt no bitterness. She could rebuild her life however she wanted. He had no desire to follow her progress. What mattered was that he no longer had to question whether the person beside him was pretending. On a warm June evening, Ethan walked along the riverfront, the city alive with tourists and laughter. He thought about everything he had lost. Then he thought about everything he'd regained. Clean break. A clear conscience. The chance to build a life he could trust again. He didn't believe in happy endings the way he used to, but he did believe in honest ones. And for him, that was enough.